afternoon. Thank you,
Good
Adam.
afternoon, everybody. I'm sorry I could not be with you here today, but considering that this launch is such a significant moment of the digital diaries process, I cannot but take time off to record and speak of my experiences of dealing with the project here, which I coordinated in Nepal. I'll start my talk by saying that it was quite a challenge to pull it off. You remember that the time it was undertaken in, it was one of the strangest times that we've all been through. There was a lockdown on, the mood was somber, there was all prevailing fear of the COVID virus. And there was this general sentiment of uncertainty and insecurity. With this background, our job was to convince ordinary Nepali people, all of whom we'd never met or known before, to participate in this digital storytelling exercise. They were required to film their own stories and somehow regularly deliver the raw footage to us for editing, even though some had no access to the internet or any form of free movement for that fact. I'll remind you here again that the country was in near complete lockdown with limitations on movement and the rising COVID cases and rising deaths due to the virus dominating the headlines and sort of distressing people's minds. Also in Nepal, we have a share of geographical challenges. We have high mountain areas, hard to access mid-hills and the southern plains, which can be blazing and uncomfortably hot during the summer months. As it happened, most of the digital diary activities here took place during the hot summer months when the monsoons were in full swing. Access to the participants was already a challenge with the lockdown, but was exacerbated further when landslides washed roads away and floods made traveling for our local contacts near impossible. Of course, it was easier for me to conduct stories that were taking place in Kathmandu, as I'm based here, but for stories in many of the outlying districts and villages, I mean, for those stories, I might have been living on the moon, so to say. So some of our contributors had access to basic cameras like a smartphone, but there are who did not possess such a device. In such cases, they were expected to take help of a friend or a family from whom they could borrow a device, or maybe have them film on their behalf. So as I said earlier, some who did not have access to the internet, it was a difficult task indeed to stay connected with them for updates and also to keep them motivated to continue with filming of the stories. But considering that none of them had any previous experience of storytelling, I mean, that too using film as a medium, I did have lingering doubts in the beginning as to whether we could pull it off. But pull it off, we did indeed. By the end of it all, we had about 20 participants. Some fell by the wayside, having lost interest, but we did end up with 10 stories that I feel are quite powerful and deserving of any screening platforms. We've taken the films back to the communities where they were made and held like large open area screenings under the heading of Lockdown Lives. So during these screenings, many in the audiences shared their experiences of the pandemic and the lockdown. We found that a key theme that ran through all the digital diary films from Nepal was that of mental health. And this was reflected during the discussions with the communities. Many indeed saw their own experiences being reflected in the films, and we did deal with quite a few emotional recollections of their lives during the lockdown. Besides, the films have also been screened at a respected film festival here in Kathmandu, and I must say that they were received very positively, and the reactions to the films were similar to the ones we had in the community. I think it did leave people with a great deal to reflect upon once they left the hall after the screenings were over. The stories that we got were quite varied. A patient on dialysis who needed 2 dialysis sessions, but followed on hard times due to the lockdown, challenges for caregivers, students' woes, the plight of daily wage earners, a large family living in close confines, a story of a medical worker who faced abuse because she was one of the earlier ones to contract the coronavirus, a father's plight to get himself and his daughter fed, and many other stories. One that really stands out for me is of a young father out of work with children to feed. So they all sort of reflected the climate of uncertainty back then, back when the times were strange. So it all worked out in the end, but getting it done was something else. The foremost was to find these contributors, and the second to convince them to participate. And again, let's not forget the stifling lockdown dominating all lives in the background. So how do we convince people to share their experiences of the COVID situation and also film themselves in the process when we cannot even meet them? How do we even convince them that our objectives are benign and that this activity will not bring any embarrassment or harm to them when they've never even met us, or they may even never meet us in the future? Our starting point were the networks of connections that we had worked with or built in the past. So these are organizations, individuals who work directly with the communities and are trusted by them, and equally important, trusted by us also. Some of, sorry, some of them were locally based NGOs, some were mothers groups at particular villages, some were youth clubs, and a few were local reporters, journalist associations. So within some of these organizations, especially the NGOs, there are someone special. They're called social mobilizers. So social mobilizers' work is to sort of work indirectly, directly with the communities at the ground or literally at the grassroots levels. There are people who go from house to house. There are people from within the community. They are the unsung heroes who ensure the success of any project interventions in the area. But most of all, they are a familiar face. And we were in great need of such faces at that time. So the social mobilizers bridged that gap for us. They were the trusted faces for the would-be participants. They would go to the participants and sort of they were like our go-between. It is difficult from a distance to try and convince people we've never met to participate or to convince them to find others to do the same. The social mobilizers, they simplified the process by helping us identify potential participants and also to introduce us to them and to explain our objectives for the process in person in their front yard, which made a difference. Also, just like social mobilizers, we had local journalists who are also familiar with the communities. We were in touch with one or two of them, and they were of invaluable help in finding people who were willing to contribute their stories. So, I mean, it's hard to explain film and storytelling to someone without an experience, but a journalist, grasps it quicker as stories are a part of their career. So we were lucky in a sense that one journalist, she happens to be the only female journalist in the district, and she had her own story to tell, and she too became she too became one of our contributors. So she was able to use herself as an example to other contributors and could easily explain to them how she did her own filming and how she covered things. Also, journalists have mobility and permission from the authorities to move around to report. So we were able to do a lot of findings, fact findings, and follow-up work with their help. So we also used ambulances or ambulance drivers. So just like journalists, ambulance or the drivers also have permission to move about because of the nature of their work. So ambulances here in Nepal, I mean, to give you a context, ferry people in need of medical care, whether it is an emergency or not. It is quite unlike the ambulance service you are familiar with. I mean, in many cases, in Nepal, people hire ambulances as it is a convenient way to transport a sick person to a hospital, as a sick person is able to travel lying down comfortably during the long drive to the hospital. So it's true that during this lockdown, when all short and long haul transportations had been suspended, including flights, some people were getting around the rules by making their journeys in hired ambulances. So we also had to give this form of movement a deep and hard look and decided that it worked for us too. But having said that, ambulances here do deal with emergency cases also. So, sorry. So we relied on some locally based ambulance drivers as our messengers when they happen to be in the area. They also happen to manage exchanges. We relied on some of them not just to deliver not just to deliver messages and instructions, but also to help us gather some of the footages from the contributors, sort of by exchanging memory cards with the footage in them. So in a way, they served as our couriers. In addition, we were also able to work over Viber and WhatsApp, where connectivity was good. The fact that in fact, the most seamless form of connection and gathering, it was the most seamless form of connecting and gathering material for us. They are instantaneous and we were able to review the materials as soon as we received them. And the best thing was that we could build a connection with the contributors more effectively, because as we began to share our photos with them, they could see who we were, what we looked like, we could understand each other, and this understanding built a connection which led to trust. So personal networks were also of great help in such circumstances. For stories or contributors from in and around Kathmandu, that is where I'm located, based, suggestions from friends, colleagues were very helpful. We found some incredibly powerful stories, and as a result, it's there online on the exhibition for you all to see. A big challenge for us at the time was to keep the contributors motivated and for them to be inclined to carry on with the filming. We asked them to share as much of their lives as possible, but sometimes it can be understandably tiresome and tedious, especially when not having a very clear idea as to the documentation process involved. Also, I mean, the miserable economic situation caused in their lives by the lockdown did not help. Some did give up on the process, but we had anticipated that given the lack of person-to-person contact and the difficulty of explaining the process over a phone or via a third person, I mean, it was bound to happen. We did call them regularly with words of encouragement, but sometimes things don't work out, as with life. We did provide financial compensation for their time and effort, but also to keep them motivated. It was a token amount, but I do believe it was of help to some people that participated, especially for those that were having a really hard time then. We are grateful to them for their participation, I mean, in spite of all that was going on in their lives. But I also do believe that for some participants, the process was somewhat cathartic. I mean, it was quite a stifling atmosphere during the lockdown and living in close quarters with the threat of COVID hanging over their heads. It did create its own unique set of circumstances. One story from the Southern Plains typically exemplifies this. In it, Lakshmi, a young woman living with 13, 14, I don't know, 15 family members in one house, would recount and record her experiences from time to time, mostly at the end of the day. So she mentioned to me later on that this was kind of a release for her and that she was better able to deal with the cramped sort of physical, mental conditions in the house with the help of this exercise. I mean, her experience of the lockdown was an existence that was filled with arguments and bickerings with her large but confined family, but a quiet recording session, expressing her thoughts and feelings on a mobile phone would do sort of wonders for her mental health. But more than anything, I think the digital diaries have become a kind of visual documentation of our society in Nepal during the lockdowns. I mean, we did hear so much then of the sufferings during at that time on the news, etc. But most of them were general reporting. Through the simple storytelling methods, we have a glimpse of their personal lives. We've gone into their homes, we've met their families, we've seen how their lives have played out. We've seen their stories through our own eyes. And I'm really grateful to the participants for sharing their lives in such candid and open manner and giving the world an understanding of their existence at this time. This entire experience for me has been, in a way, a humbling one. And I'm proud of the films that have come out as a result. And I know that some of the participants feel the same also. So as I said in the beginning, it was quite a challenge. And I did have my doubts as to whether we could get it done, given the circumstances. Sorry, but it did happen. And I hope you take some time out to see some of the lives that played out during the COVID lockdown in Nepal. I mean, it gave me great satisfaction indeed when semi-normalcy returned, once the lockdowns were lifted, and I got to meet some of the participants in person. Like I said, the effort has played out very well, and I would like to dedicate the stories from Nepal to this young father featured in one of the stories, who unfortunately took his own life shortly after his story was filmed due to mental trauma and the financial uncertainties that hit him all of a sudden because of the lockdown. So I hope you will take a time out and visit some of the stories on the Digital Diary virtual exhibition. Thank you so much. Thank you very much for your time. Thank you indeed.